Have you ever wondered what it takes for a human being to reach the point where fear simply ceases to exist? Not the absence of danger, but something far more unsettling, the complete dissolution of self-preservation in the face of something greater than survival itself. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that historians tried to bury, that plantation owners burned from their records, and that survivors whispered only in the darkest hours of the night when no overseer could hear. This is the account of a woman whose name was stripped from official documents, whose face was erased from portraits, and whose actions rewrote the rules of resistance in ways that still echo through the American South to this day. What you're about to hear isn't comfortable. It isn't clean, and it most certainly isn't the version of history they taught you in school. But it is true, verified through letters discovered in a collapsed cellar in Charleston, through the trembling testimonies recorded by a German botanist who happened to be present, and through the nightmares that plagued the descendants of those who witnessed what happened on that humid September evening in 1847. If you're the kind of person who believes that the truth matters more than comfort, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to reveal will change the way you understand courage, vengeance, and the terrible price of dignity. Her name was Mercy, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why a baron, a man who had seen wars, duels, and executions across 3 continents, looked into her scarred face and called her the bravest soul alive. Let's begin. The Ashworth Plantation no longer exists on any modern map of South Carolina. Where 300 acres of cotton once stretched toward the Santee River, there now stands only a gas station and a strip of highway that trucks barrel through without slowing. Locals avoid the rest stop after dark. They claim the air conditioning fails without reason. They say voices rise from the drainage ditches when the summer heat makes the asphalt shimmer. But in 1847, this was among the most prosperous cotton operations in the entire Lowcountry. 1,400 souls labored beneath its sun, men, women, and children, whose bodies belonged to Cornelius Ashworth III, whose grandfather had built the empire on the bones of the Yamasee people and the labor of 4 generations of the enslaved. The main house rose like a white cathedral against the endless green. 28 columns. A ballroom that could hold 200 guests. A wine cellar imported stone by stone from Bordeaux. And beneath the kitchen, a crawl space where punishment was administered with such regularity that the earth itself had absorbed enough blood to turn permanently dark. Today, if you dig 3 feet into the soil where the smokehouse once stood, you'll find something peculiar. Fragments of porcelain that don't match any pattern from the Ashworth collection. These pieces, blue and white with lotus flowers in the Chinese style, belonged to a woman named Mercy. She had carried them in her apron pocket from the moment she arrived at the plantation at age 11 until the moment she decided that the Ashworth family would never see another sunrise. The porcelain had belonged to her mother, and what happened to her mother is where our story truly begins. If you want to follow more cases like this, ones that shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about history, subscribe to this channel now. Because the truth doesn't stay buried forever, and neither did Mercy. The Ashworth Plantation operated like a small nation with its own laws, currency, and executioners. At its center stood the main house, gleaming white, its columns casting shadows that stretched toward the slave quarters like accusing fingers every afternoon at 4 o'clock. Around it, arranged with military precision, spread the machinery of cotton production, the gin house with its screaming gears, the press house where men lost fingers to the compacting mechanisms, the seed house that filled with deadly gases if the ventilation failed, and the infirmary, a generous term for a wooden shed where the dying were left to die without disturbing the field rotation schedules. The quarters housed 1,400 enslaved people in structures measuring exactly 12 feet by 14 feet. 8 to 12 bodies per cabin. No windows by design. Cornelius believed that darkness encouraged sleep and discouraged the gathering of treasonous thoughts. The roofs leaked, the floors were packed earth that turned to mud for 5 months of the year, and the locks on the doors secured from the outside so that during troubled times, entire families could be sealed inside while the overseers decided their fate. The day began at 4 in the morning with a bell that had been salvaged from a merchant ship. The same ship, the enslaved whispered, that had brought the first Ashworth fortune from the Gold Coast a century before. By 4:30, Every soul between the ages of 7 and 65 was expected in the fields. Those who failed to appear faced the post, a vertical beam of oak standing exactly 5 feet 9 inches tall, positioned at the center of the yard where everyone could witness what happened to the disobedient. The hierarchy of cruelty was precise. At the top sat Cornelius himself, a man of 63 who rarely emerged from his study, but whose orders arrived through a network of overseers, drivers, and informants as complex as any royal court. Below him, 4 white overseers managed the field operations with quotas that increased every harvest. Below them, 12 black drivers, enslaved men who had been given whips and the impossible choice between using them on their own people or taking their place at the post. And at the bottom, though perhaps most feared of all, was the house itself, with its head butler, its kitchen staff, and the woman who ran it all with an iron fist, Martha, the housekeeper, whose favor could mean assignment to the relatively survivable indoor work, and whose disfavor meant immediate transfer to the sugar processing, where the boiling vats claimed limbs with clockwork regularity. The sounds of Ashworth never ceased. The crack of whips at dawn, the grinding of the gin through the afternoon, the screaming from the punishment shed that everyone pretended not to hear, and at night, the singing, the only hour when voices were permitted to rise, carefully monitored hymns that the overseers believed kept the workers spiritually docile. What the overseers didn't know was that the hymns contained messages. The tempo indicated danger levels. The selected verses communicated meeting times. And the harmonies hid information about which overseer was drunk, which path was unguarded, and which stars to follow if you ran. Into this world, at age 11, arrived a girl from the Tidewater region of Virginia. She had no name in the official records, only a purchase number and a notation about the scars already marking her back. But among the enslaved, she was called Mercy. Not because anyone had shown her any, but because of what she herself extended to others, a gentleness with the sick, a patience with the dying, and a memory that would one day prove more dangerous than any weapon in the Ashworth armory. Mercy remembered everything: names, dates, the particular pitch of each overseer's voice, the exact number of lashes given for each offense. And most dangerously of all, she remembered what they did to her mother in the tobacco fields of Virginia. The reason she had been sold south in the first place, to separate her from any community that might remember, might testify, might seek redress. They didn't know that selling her was the worst mistake the Virginia plantation owners would ever make. Because at Ashworth, Mercy would find something she had never had before: the tools, the knowledge, and the allies to make every man who had ever held a whip understand exactly what it felt like to be powerless. The summer of 1847 was the hottest in recorded memory. The Santee River dropped to levels not seen in a generation. The cotton bolls opened early, cracking in the heat, demanding harvest before their time. And in the kitchen house, separated from the main residence by exactly 47 feet of crushed oyster shell pathway, a woman with scars across her shoulders prepared the Ashworth family's meals with hands that never trembled. No one looked twice at her. That was her greatest weapon. Mercy had been at Ashworth for 23 years by the summer of 1847. In that time, she had become something rare and invaluable, a person who existed in 2 worlds simultaneously while truly belonging to neither. In the main house, she was known as reliable, silent, and skilled. Cornelius himself had remarked more than once that her corn pudding was the finest in the Carolinas. His wife, a perpetually nervous woman named Eugenia, who suffered from ailments both real and imagined, depended on Mercy's herbal remedies for everything from migraines to insomnia. The Ashworth children, 2 sons and a daughter, all grown now, all inheriting their father's capacity for casual cruelty, had been raised on her cooking, had their scrapes bandaged by her hands, had their nightmares soothed by her voice in the years before they understood that the woman comforting them was their property. What the Ashworth family didn't know could fill libraries. They didn't know that Mercy could read, a secret taught to her by a dying enslaved man in Virginia, a former house servant from Senegal who had been literate in Arabic, French, and English before his capture. She had learned by candlelight, tracing letters in ash, memorizing the shapes of words that appeared in the newspapers the Ashworths discarded. By 1847, she read better than several of the overseers, and understood contracts, legal documents, and the letters that arrived weekly from Cornelius's business partners in Charleston. They didn't know that she understood medicine, not the folk remedies she prepared for Mrs. Eugenia, but actual pharmacology, gleaned from a medical text she had stolen from the library and replaced before dawn. She knew which plants healed and which killed. She knew the doses that cured and the doses that destroyed. She knew that foxglove in tiny amounts strengthened the heart, and in larger amounts stopped it entirely. This knowledge she kept locked away, waiting. They didn't know that she had memorized the patrol schedules, the location of every weapon in the house, the rotation of the overseers, the dates when Cornelius received cash shipments from his cotton factors, and the names of every family member, white and black, who had died on the plantation in her 23 years of watching. Most importantly, they didn't know that she had spent the last 7 years building a network that extended from the Ashworth kitchen to plantations as far as Georgia and Virginia. Through the enslaved people who traveled with visiting families, through the free blacks who delivered goods from Charleston, through the sailors, some formerly enslaved themselves, who docked at the river landing, Mercy had constructed an information system that would have impressed military intelligence. She knew which plantations were planning escapes. She knew which stations on the Underground Railroad were safe and which had been compromised. She knew the names of abolitionists in the North who funded freedom operations, and the names of slave catchers who hunted runaways for bounty. All of this she carried behind a face that betrayed nothing. The other enslaved people at Ashworth understood, without ever speaking of it directly, that Mercy was different. The children gravitated toward her when they were hurt. The elderly sought her out when they were dying. The young men and women who had been broken by the post or the breeding shed found their way to the kitchen house after dark, where Mercy would give them food, medicine, and something more valuable than either. She would listen, and she would remember. She remembered Josiah, age 15, who had been whipped until the bones of his spine showed because he was too slow picking cotton with hands still cramped from growth. She remembered Sarah, age 22, who had been sold away from her 3 children because Cornelius needed to pay a gambling debt. She remembered Thomas, age 47, who had organized a work slowdown and was made to watch his brother burn alive as punishment. She remembered every name, every date, every method of cruelty employed by every overseer, driver, and Ashworth family member. The white folk saw a woman of 34, slight, scarred, perpetually bent over pots and laundry, dressed in the same faded gray cotton as every other house slave. They saw silence, obedience, competence. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see. What they could not see was the ledger she kept in her mind. 23 years of accounts. Debts that would one day be collected with interest. Leave a comment below. Never give up on the truth. If you believe that justice must find its way to every corner of history, no matter how long it takes. The year 1847 did not invent cruelty at the Ashworth plantation. It merely concentrated it, compressed it, forced it to reveal its true face in ways that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. January brought the coldest freeze in a decade. Cornelius, worried about his cotton stores, ordered the enslaved to work through temperatures that killed 3 elderly field hands within a week. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves by the river. No time was given for mourning. The quotas didn't change. February saw the arrival of a new overseer named Wickham, a failed farmer from Tennessee who had discovered that he had a talent for causing pain. His first week on the property, he broke the arm of a 12-year-old boy named Peter who had stumbled while carrying water. The arm was set badly. It never healed properly. Peter spent the rest of his short life unable to straighten his elbow. March brought the incident that people still whispered about years later, though none could speak of it directly without their voices breaking. A woman named Rose had hidden her pregnancy for 7 months, terrified that Cornelius would sell the child before she could name it. When her condition was discovered, she was brought before the main house. What happened next lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, there was no child, there was no Rose, and there was a stain on the white oyster shell pathway that the spring rains couldn't wash away. Mercy watched. Mercy remembered. April brought the sale that separated families without warning. 23 souls sent to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a death sentence disguised as a business transaction. Among them was a woman named Grace, who had been Mercy's closest friend for 15 years, who had helped her through the fever that nearly killed her in '39, who had taught her the songs that carried messages through the night air. Grace was torn from her husband and her 2 surviving children with no more ceremony than the transfer of livestock. Mercy stood at the edge of the yard and watched the wagon disappear down the road, her face betraying nothing, her hands steady, her memory burning every detail into permanence. May brought the breeding shed. The Ashworth practice of forced reproduction had always been present, but this season, Cornelius, facing mounting debts and falling cotton prices, intensified it. Young women were assigned to men, not their husbands, paired by Cornelius himself, based on which combinations he believed would produce the strongest offspring. Those who resisted were whipped. Those who succeeded were given extra food rations and the knowledge that their children would never truly belong to them. June brought the heat and with it the dying. The infirmary filled. The field quotas didn't drop. Workers collapsed in the rows and were carried to the shed to either recover or stop breathing. The physician from Charleston, a man named Hartwell who visited quarterly, declared the death rate regrettable but within normal parameters. He never set foot in the quarters. He never learned the names of those who died under his statistical supervision. Through all of this, Mercy cooked. She prepared breakfast at 4 in the morning and dinner at 7 in the evening. She brought Mrs. Eugenia her headache remedies and Mr. Cornelius his whiskey. She watched the Ashworth children, now adults, now complicit, now ordering punishments of their own, sit at the table and discuss cotton futures while 3 miles away, their property died in the fields. And something inside her, something that had been building for 23 years, began to crystallize into purpose. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was gradual, accumulating weight like water behind a dam. Each death, each sale, each scream from the punishment shed added another drop. Each meal served with steady hands and downcast eyes. Each "yes, ma'am" and "yes, sir" that scraped against her throat like broken glass. By July, the dam was beginning to crack. By August, she had stopped pretending, at least to herself, that she was merely surviving. By September, she had begun to plan. The transformation came, as such things do, through loss. Her name was Hannah, and she was Mercy's sister by every measure except blood. They had arrived at Ashworth within a month of each other, both sold from Virginia plantations, both bearing the marks of previous brutality, both young enough to imagine that this new hell might somehow be navigable. Together, they had learned the rhythms of survival. Together, they had built the small, fragile structures of meaning that made existence bearable. Shared meals after midnight, whispered conversations in the wash house, the slow accumulation of tiny rebellions that no overseer could detect. Hannah worked in the weaving house, producing the coarse cloth that dressed the enslaved population and the finer fabric that the Ashworths sold for profit. Her fingers were quick, her mind quicker. She had developed a system for communicating with runaways, messages woven into the patterns of cloth that looked like decorative flourishes to white eyes, but carried detailed instructions to those who knew how to read them. In the last week of August, this system was discovered. The betrayal came from within, a man named Isaac who had been promised lighter work and extra rations in exchange for information about disloyal elements. He had observed Hannah's hands. He had noticed the patterns that didn't match standard designs. And he had gone, with the craven eagerness of the desperate, to Cornelius Ashworth's oldest son, Marcus. Marcus was 28 years old and already known across 3 counties as a man who found pleasure in suffering that wasn't his own. He had been raised on the absolute certainty that the people who worked his father's land were instruments, tools, resources to be used and discarded according to economic necessity. He had never questioned this belief because he had never needed to. The system had been designed to prevent him from seeing the humanity he destroyed. What he did to Hannah lasted for 3 days. The first day was the questioning. Marcus wanted names, routes, connections. Hannah gave him nothing. Not because she was brave, though she was, but because she understood that the people her information would condemn were already beyond her protection. Speaking would not save them. It would only add their deaths to her conscience. The second day was punishment. It took place at the post, in full view of the quarters, as an educational exercise for the rest of the enslaved population. The details cannot be spoken aloud. They can only be suggested through the reactions of those who witnessed: the children who couldn't be prevented from seeing, the adults who couldn't look away, the driver who wielded the whip until his arm gave out and another driver had to replace him. The third day was the burning. Cornelius believed in thoroughness. He believed that rebellion was a disease, and that diseases required not just treatment but eradication. He believed that the other enslaved needed to understand, at a visceral level, what awaited anyone who disrupted his operation. They built the pyre at dawn. They brought Hannah at noon. And by sunset, there was nothing left except ash, smoke, and the sound of Mercy's voice rising above the enforced silence of the quarters in a hymn that none of the overseers recognized. That night, alone in the kitchen house, Mercy held the fragments of her mother's porcelain and made a decision that would echo across history. She did not cry. She had forgotten how, somewhere in the 23 years of watching. Instead, she spoke. Softly to the darkness, to the memory of her sister, to the ghosts of everyone she had lost. "I will make them understand," she said, "before the year ends, every one of them. I will make them know what it feels like to have everything taken." The porcelain fragments caught the moonlight coming through the single small window. The lotus flowers seemed to move in the flickering illumination, as if stirred by a wind that didn't exist. By morning, she had the outline of a plan. By the following week, she had begun assembling her allies. And by September, she had created something that would haunt the South Carolina Lowcountry for generations. A method so elegant, so devastating, and so impossible to trace that plantation owners from Charleston to Savannah would spend years trying to understand how it had been done. They would call it, eventually, the Ashworth treatment, but that name would come later, from the white historians who tried to minimize what had happened. Among the enslaved, it had a different name. They called it Mercy's Gift. To understand what Mercy did, you must first understand who she did it to. Cornelius Ashworth III was not a monster in the theatrical sense. He did not revel in cruelty for its own sake. He was something more dangerous, a man who had convinced himself that his actions were rational, necessary, even benevolent. He told himself that the enslaved people in his possession were better off under his management than they would be as free persons, unable to care for themselves in a world that would not accept them. This belief insulated him from the reality of what he created. Every death was an unfortunate necessity. Every punishment was a lesson. Every sale was a business decision. His oldest son, Marcus, lacked even this veneer of rationalization. Marcus simply enjoyed power. He had grown up watching his father exercise absolute authority over 1,400 human beings and had concluded that this authority was his birthright. The infliction of suffering proved his superiority. The fear in other people's eyes confirmed his worth. At 28, he had already killed 3 enslaved people directly and was responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen more through the conditions he imposed on those under his direct supervision. The younger son, William, was more complex. At 24, he had attended 2 years of university in Philadelphia before being recalled home to learn the family business. Those 2 years had exposed him to ideas that made him uncomfortable: abolition, human rights, the arguments of Northern intellectuals who questioned the entire structure of Southern society. He had returned to Ashworth with doubts that he could not express and complicity that he could not escape. His method of coping was silence and alcohol. By 1847, he was drunk by noon most days and absent from the plantation's operations as much as he could manage. The daughter, Catherine, at 22, had been raised to see the enslaved as furniture, present but not quite real. She supervised the house staff with the same attention she might give to arranging flowers, aesthetic concern without emotional engagement. The people who served her meals, dressed her hair, and cleaned her rooms existed in her perception as functional objects that occasionally required maintenance. She had never struck anyone herself. She had merely given orders and not cared what happened when those orders were fulfilled. Cornelius's wife, Eugenia, lived in a fog of laudanum and denial. Her nervous ailments, whether genuine or cultivated as a method of psychological escape, kept her confined to her rooms for much of the year. She knew in some buried part of her mind what her family's wealth was built upon. This knowledge manifested as nightmares she reported to Mercy in their sessions of herbal remedy consultation, dreams of blood that wouldn't wash away, of faces that stared at her from the fields, of a house that was slowly sinking into the earth no matter how many columns held it up. And then there were the overseers. Wickham, the newest arrival, with his talent for creative brutality. Henderson, who had been at Ashworth for 15 years and had developed such comprehensive methods of psychological torment that new arrivals sometimes begged for physical punishment instead. Morrison, who specialized in the breeding shed and who selected women based on criteria that he discussed with the openness of a horse trader. And Douglas, the head overseer, who managed the entire operation with the efficiency of a military commander and the conscience of a machine. These were the enemies. These were the names in Mercy's ledger. But it was a stranger who provided the catalyst that set everything in motion. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, not related to the Revolutionary War general, though he cultivated the confusion, arrived at Ashworth in the first week of September 1847. He was a German aristocrat of uncertain fortune, traveling through the American South on what he described as an expedition of botanical and anthropological observation. In reality, he was fleeing gambling debts in Vienna and hoping to write a book about American slavery that would restore his reputation and his finances. The Baron was, in his own way, a terrible person. He viewed the enslaved with the same detached curiosity that a naturalist might observe exotic animals. He took notes. He made sketches. He asked questions of the Ashworth family about productivity, discipline, and the management of the Negro character. He was not an abolitionist. He had no moral objection to the institution he observed. But he was, crucially, an outsider, someone whose presence disrupted the closed system of the plantation and created possibilities that had not existed before. What he witnessed during his 3-week stay would transform him entirely. The book he eventually wrote, published in Berlin in 1852, suppressed in the American South, and rediscovered in 1923 in a Danish archive, remains the only first-hand account of what happened at Ashworth in September 1847. According to his records, it was on his 5th day at the plantation that he first noticed Mercy. She was serving dinner when their eyes met. In his journal, he recorded the moment. I have seen many enslaved persons during my travels through this country. Most display the expected signs of their condition: downcast eyes, submissive posture, the absence of visible interiority. This woman was different. She looked at me directly, for perhaps half a second, and in that glance I perceived something I had not expected to encounter. Intelligence, certainly, but more than that, purpose. This woman was waiting for something. I could not shake the sensation that I was being observed far more carefully than I was observing. He had no idea how right he was. 2 days after the Baron's observation, Mercy received her final confirmation that there would be no justice through normal channels, that there was no one coming to save them, that the world had arranged itself to ensure their suffering and their silence. It came, as such confirmations often do, through public humiliation. Mrs. Eugenia had misplaced a silver hairpin, a small item, worth perhaps $15, given to her by her mother as a wedding gift. The loss sent her into a spiral of anxiety that demanded resolution. And in the absence of any other explanation, suspicion fell on the house staff. Cornelius, annoyed by his wife's distress and eager to demonstrate his authority before his distinguished guest, ordered all house slaves to the front yard for examination. Examination meant stripping. Examination meant being searched thoroughly and invasively by Henderson and Wickham, while the Ashworth family watched from the portico and the Baron took notes from a wicker chair. Mercy was 40 years old. She had served the family faithfully, by their definition of faithful, for 23 years. She had nursed their children, healed their ailments, kept their secrets, and protected their health with remedies that she alone knew how to prepare. And now she stood naked in the morning sun, while rough hands searched her body for a hairpin that would later be found behind Mrs. Eugenia's vanity, where it had fallen 3 days earlier. The Baron recorded what he saw. The woman called Mercy stood with a stillness I have only witnessed in soldiers awaiting certain death. She did not flinch. She did not weep. She maintained an expression of such profound absence that I found myself wondering if she had somehow departed her body entirely, leaving only a shell for the overseers to examine. When Henderson spoke to her, crude words that I will not transcribe, she looked at him with eyes that contained nothing, less than nothing, a void. The hairpin was not found because the hairpin was not there. The slaves were dismissed back to their duties. Mrs. Eugenia continued her lamentations. The Baron returned to his room to write in his journal, and Mercy, dressed once more in her gray cotton shift, walked to the kitchen house with steps that did not waver. That afternoon, she sent for 7 people, one at a time, through channels of communication that left no evidence. Each summoned person arrived at different times, stayed for different durations, and left with a piece of information that, alone, meant nothing. Together, those pieces formed a plan. The humiliation had been the final weight. The dam had broken. And what poured through was not rage. Rage was too hot, too visible, too easily detected. What poured through was something colder, methodical, patient. Mercy had learned in her 23 years of observation that the Ashworth family's greatest weakness was their certainty. They were certain of their superiority, certain of their safety, certain that the people they owned were incapable of meaningful resistance. She would use that certainty against them. The plan that Mercy constructed over the following 3 weeks was a masterwork of logistics, psychology, and timing. It required the coordination of 23 people across 6 different work sites. It demanded the procurement of materials that could not be traced. It necessitated the creation of alibis that would withstand interrogation. And it depended, absolutely, on the maintenance of perfect secrecy in an environment where informants were everywhere. How she achieved this remains, in part, a mystery. The Baron's account provides fragments. The subsequent investigation recovered pieces. But the full picture can only be reconstructed through inference, through understanding of the system she navigated, through recognition of the genius required to operate invisibly within a structure designed to make invisibility impossible. The core team consisted of 7 individuals, each selected for specific capabilities. Solomon, a blacksmith in his 40s, who had access to the forge and the ability to create or modify metal implements without arousing suspicion. His official work involved repairing farm equipment and shoeing horses. His unofficial contribution was the creation of 7 identical keys, copies of the master key that Henderson carried, produced through a wax impression that had taken 3 months to obtain. Ruth, a laundress in her 50s, who moved between the main house and the quarters with the freedom that dirty linens provided. She was the primary messenger, carrying information in the folds of clothing, in the patterns of how items were folded, in codes that only the recipients could read. Daniel, a young man of 19 who worked in the stables and who had been purchased from a Virginia plantation where he had learned to read and write from a sympathetic mistress. He forged the documents, letters that appeared to come from cotton factors in Charleston, from business partners in Savannah, from anyone whose communications might justify the movements and activities that the plan required. Esther, a woman of 63 who supervised the sick house, who had memorized, over 4 decades of practice, the healing and killing properties of every plant that grew in the Low Country. Her contribution was pharmaceutical, preparations that would not kill immediately, that would not leave obvious traces, that would create symptoms explainable by natural causes. Jacob, a driver, one of those terrible intermediary figures who wielded the whip against his own people, but who had done so for 15 years while feeding information to runaways, while manipulating work assignments to protect the vulnerable, while playing a long game that few suspected. His contribution was strategic. Knowledge of the overseer's rotations, the patrol schedules, the gaps in surveillance that could be exploited. Martha, the head housekeeper herself, whose apparent loyalty to the Ashworths was so complete that no one questioned her presence anywhere in the main house. She was Mercy's oldest ally, having arrived at Ashworth a decade before Mercy herself. Their partnership was so careful, so hidden, that even the other conspirators didn't know its full extent. Martha provided access, Unlocked doors, unguarded moments, intelligence about which family members would be where and when. And finally, there was Thomas, a man of 30 who had been educated in secret by a Quaker minister and who served as the plan's chaplain, the spiritual center that held the group together when fear threatened to fragment them, who reminded them of the righteousness of their cause, who prayed with them in stolen moments and promised that whatever happened, their souls were beyond the reach of the Ashworths. Each of these individuals took on risk that, if discovered, would mean death. Not quick death. The kind of death that Cornelius reserved for those who challenged his authority directly. They knew this. They committed anyway. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, the softening, would begin 2 weeks before the main event. Small disruptions, impossible to trace, that would create anxiety and distraction. Missing items, unexplained noises, livestock behaving strangely, servants appearing in places they shouldn't be, then vanishing before anyone could be certain they'd been seen. The goal was psychological, to make the Ashworth family and their overseers slightly uncertain, slightly on edge, slightly less attentive to the obvious because they were busy looking for the inexplicable. Phase 2, the preparation, would occur in the final 3 days. Strategic placement of materials, confirmation of assignments, communication of the exact timing that would determine success or failure. Phase 3, the gift, would happen on the night of September 27th, during the harvest celebration ball that Cornelius hosted annually for the neighboring plantation families. The house would be full of guests. The overseers would be distracted by their duties managing increased traffic. The enslaved would have unusual freedom of movement due to the serving requirements of the event. The date itself was significant. September 27th was the anniversary of Hannah's death. It was also, and this was not coincidence, the anniversary of the sale that had separated Mercy from her mother 26 years before. Justice, Mercy believed, should have a sense of timing. The method would later be called the Ashworth treatment by those who sought to minimize its implications, to frame it as an aberration rather than an answer. It was, in fact, quite simple in concept and devastatingly complex in execution. Every member of the Ashworth family and every overseer who had participated directly in the worst atrocities would receive a personal reckoning. Not death, at least not immediately. Something more elegant, something that would leave them alive long enough to understand exactly what was happening to them and why. The preparation of the substances fell to Esther. The delivery system fell to Mercy herself through the food she prepared for that night's feast. And the aftermath, the escape of those who wished to run, the protection of those who stayed, fell to the network that Mercy had spent years constructing. It was, by any measure, an act of war. The enslaved had no legal standing to conduct war. They had no recognized right to self-defense. The law said they were property, and property could not rebel against its owners without becoming subject to the most extreme sanctions the state could apply. Mercy knew this. They all knew this, and they understood that what they were about to do would either succeed completely or destroy them utterly. There was no middle ground. There was no escape hatch. There was only the plan, the date, and the hope that somehow, some way, this night would become the beginning of something larger than their own lives. The countdown began. September 26th, 1847. The day before, everything changed. The main house hummed with preparation. The Harvest Ball was an annual event that drew plantation families from across the Low Country, an opportunity to display wealth, arrange marriages, discuss business, and reinforce the social bonds that held the slaveholding class together. This year, with the Baron in attendance, Cornelius had decided to make the celebration especially elaborate. Extra candles had been ordered from Charleston. A string quartet had been hired. The menu had been expanded to include dishes that would demonstrate the sophistication of Southern hospitality. In the kitchen house, Mercy worked with 3 assistants to prepare the feast. Roast beef with herb crust, oysters from the local beds, corn pudding, her specialty, rice dishes of 7 different varieties, cakes and pastries and sugared fruits, and wine, brought up from the cellar in quantities that would ensure every guest reached the pleasant fog of intoxication that made the evening's later activities possible. From the outside, she appeared completely focused on her work. The assistants, two young women who had been assigned to help without any knowledge of what was planned, noticed nothing unusual. Mercy gave directions, tasted preparations, adjusted seasonings with her usual precision. Only once did she pause. Near sunset, when the light came through the kitchen windows at the angle that reminded her of the evening Hannah had been taken to the post, she stopped stirring and stood perfectly still for 11 seconds. Then she continued as if nothing had happened. In the quarters, the softening phase reached its conclusion. Over the past 2 weeks, the small disruptions had accumulated into a pervasive sense of unease. Henderson had complained to Cornelius about tools that vanished and reappeared in wrong locations. Wickham had reported seeing figures at the edge of the fields that disappeared when he approached. Morrison had discovered that his boots had been filled with sand. Impossible to trace, impossible to punish, impossible to ignore. The overseers were on edge, the family was distracted, and tonight, with the house full of guests, with the attention demanded by social performance, with the wine flowing and the music playing, no one would be watching the kitchen. Solomon, in his forge, completed the final preparations. 7 identical keys, tested and confirmed against the master lock. Small metal implements that could be concealed in clothing. Items that had no purpose except the one they would serve tonight. Ruth moved through the main house with an armload of linens, checking sight lines, confirming routes, noting which doors would be locked and which would remain open for the convenience of guests. Daniel had the documents ready. Letters that would create confusion in the aftermath, that would point suspicion in directions that led nowhere, that would buy time for those who needed to run. Esther had completed her preparations days ago. The substances were stable, measured, divided into portions that Mercy had memorized. There would be no written instructions, no physical evidence, nothing that could be found if the plan failed and the interrogations began. Jacob had confirmed the patrol schedule. Between midnight and 2 in the morning, the gap in surveillance would be at its widest. The overseers would be monitoring the ball. The drivers would be confined to quarters. The roads leading north would be unwatched for precious hours. Martha had unlocked the doors that needed to be unlocked, had arranged the items that needed to be arranged, had confirmed to Mercy with a single glance across the dining room that everything was in place. And Thomas had gathered those who needed gathering, had prayed with those who needed prayer, had promised that whatever happened tomorrow, they had done something that mattered. The sun set over the Santee River, painting the water in shades of orange and red that looked to those who knew what was coming like fire. In the main house, the Ashworth family dressed for the evening. Cornelius in his finest suit, imported from London. Eugenia in silk that had been stitched by hands that would be remembered tonight. Marcus in the military-style jacket he affected despite never having served. William, already drunk, fumbling with his cufflinks. Catherine, consulting with her maid about which jewels would best catch the candlelight. The Baron, in his guest room, wrote in his journal, "There is an unusual energy in the air tonight. The servants move with a precision that suggests more than ordinary preparation." The woman Mercy, whom I have observed over these weeks, seems especially focused. If I did not know better, I would say that she is anticipating something. But what could a house slave anticipate except another night of service? He would understand soon enough. At 9 o'clock, the first carriages arrived. The torches were lit along the drive. The music began. And Mercy, standing in the kitchen house with her assistants, began to plate the first courses of what would later be known as the last meal the Ashworth family would ever eat together. The ball reached its peak at 11:30. The Baron's account, supplemented by testimonies gathered in the investigation's aftermath, provides a detailed reconstruction of the evening's transformation from celebration to something else entirely. By that hour, 53 guests filled the ballroom and adjoining parlors. The quartet played waltzes that European visitors had brought to the Carolina coast. The conversation centered on cotton prices, the election of '48, and the growing agitation of Northern abolitionists who didn't understand the peculiar institution they sought to destroy. Cornelius held court near the fireplace, discussing expansion plans with 2 neighboring planters. Marcus circulated among the young women, his reputation apparently no hindrance to families seeking advantageous connections. William had retreated to the veranda with a bottle. Catherine danced with the sons of the county's leading families, and Eugenia, overwhelmed by the noise and the crowds, had excused herself to her rooms with one of Mercy's calming preparations. The first course had been served at 10, the main course at past. Desserts were being plated now in the kitchen house, under Mercy's direct supervision. Each plate was identical except in the ways that mattered. The portions for the family had been prepared separately. The portions for the overseers, who ate in a smaller room adjacent to the kitchen, taking their meals in shifts so that surveillance of the ball could continue, had been prepared with the same care. Mercy's hands did not shake as she added the final garnishes. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind. The quantities were exact, the timing was calculated, and the effects, when they came, would be impossible to distinguish from natural causes. At 11:45, the desserts reached the dining room. At 11:50, the overseers received their servings. The Baron ate the same food as everyone else. The preparations Mercy had made were for specific individuals only. He would later describe the dessert as extraordinary, a confection of cream and berries that seemed to capture the essence of the southern summer. He had no idea that 3 tables away, Cornelius Ashworth was consuming something quite different. The effects began at past midnight. Cornelius felt it first, a tightness in his chest that he attributed to rich food and excitement. He excused himself from his conversation, walked to the veranda for air, found William already there. They exchanged words, the last they would ever share, about the evening's success. At 12:45, Marcus collapsed on the dance floor. The young woman in his arms screamed. The music stopped. The crowd pressed forward, then back, uncertain what to do. Someone called for the physician who had come as a guest. He examined Marcus and found a pulse that raced, then slowed, then raced again in patterns he couldn't explain. By 1 o'clock, Henderson was vomiting in the kitchen yard. Wickham was unable to stand. Morrison had locked himself in the overseer's quarters, convinced that he was dying. And Douglas, the head overseer, was searching frantically for the source of what he was beginning to understand was an attack. But there was no source to find. The kitchen had been cleaned. The serving dishes had been washed. Mercy stood in the doorway with the other house slaves, displaying the same confusion and concern as everyone around her. The Baron's account of the next hour is fragmented, his own observations interrupted by the chaos around him. The household has descended into pandemonium. Mr. Ashworth the elder is bedridden, attended by 2 physicians who seem unable to agree on a diagnosis. The son, Marcus, has not regained consciousness. The overseers are incapacitated to a man, and yet none of the guests, none of the other servants, display any symptoms. This is not a common illness. This is something else. In the quarters, those who knew what was happening waited for the signal. At 1:30, Ruth appeared at the door of the main slave cabin. She carried an empty laundry basket. She set it down, adjusted its position so that the handle faced north, and walked away. The signal had been given. Phase 3 was complete. What happened next was not part of the original plan. It was improvisation, the response of enslaved people who suddenly found themselves in a world where the structures of control had been suspended. 47 people left the Ashworth plantation that night. They moved in groups of 3 and 4, following routes that Jacob had mapped, using the chaos of the main house as cover. Some headed north toward the underground railroad stations that Mercy had identified. Some headed for the swamps, where communities of runaways had established hidden settlements. Some simply walked into the darkness, choosing unknown freedom over certain bondage. Those who stayed, the elderly, the very young, those too afraid to run, gathered in the quarters and waited for dawn. At 3 in the morning, Mercy walked into the main house. She found Cornelius in his bedroom, attended by his wife and the physicians who had been summoned from the party. His skin was gray. His breathing was shallow. His eyes, when they opened, struggled to focus. She approached the bed. The physicians moved to stop her. What was this slave doing here? But Eugenia waved them away. She trusted Mercy. She had always trusted Mercy. Perhaps Mercy could help. Mercy leaned close to Cornelius, close enough that only he could hear her words. "You wanted to know if we had souls," she whispered. You wondered if we could think and feel and plan. Now you know. You're going to live, Mr. Cornelius. You're going to live with the knowledge that everything you are, everything you built, was unmade by a woman whose name you never bothered to learn. She straightened. She looked at Eugenia, at the physicians, at the chaos of a world that would never be the same. And then she walked out of the room, down the stairs, through the kitchen, and into the night. What happened in the hours after Mercy's departure from the main house has been reconstructed from multiple sources. The Baron's observations, the testimonies of enslaved people who later reached freedom in the North, and the official records of the investigation that followed. At approximately 4 a.m, fire broke out in the overseer's quarters. The origin was never conclusively determined. The official investigation attributed it to a lamp knocked over by Morrison, who was still incapacitated from whatever substance had affected him. Others suggested more intentional causes. What is certain is that the building burned completely, taking with it the records, the weapons, and the accumulated documentation of 20 years of brutality. The fire spread to the gin house before it could be contained, then to the seed storage. Then to 3 of the slave cabins, empty by that time. Their former occupants either fled or gathered in safer locations. By dawn, a third of the Ashworth plantation's infrastructure had been destroyed. Cornelius survived. The physicians eventually determined that he had ingested a substantial quantity of digitalis, foxglove extract, in a dose calibrated to incapacitate without killing. The same substance had been administered to Marcus, to Henderson, to Wickham, to Morrison, to Douglas. Each had received a dose proportional to their role in the atrocities Mercy had documented. Each would experience weeks of recovery. Each would understand, in the long hours of their convalescence, that they had been judged and sentenced by those they had believed incapable of judgment. William, who had been too drunk to eat dessert, was unaffected. Catherine, who had been dieting in preparation for the ball, had eaten only a small portion. Neither would escape the consequences of what had happened, but neither faced the physical reckoning that had been prepared for the primary perpetrators. The Baron remained at Ashworth for 2 more days, observing the aftermath. His account of those days would later be suppressed in the American South. I have witnessed the destruction of a world. Not merely physical destruction, though that is considerable, but the collapse of an entire system of belief. The Ashworth family proceeds as if their authority remains intact, but I observe something in the eyes of those who remain enslaved here. They know. They know that what was done cannot be undone, that power once revealed as vulnerable can never again appear absolute. The woman Mercy has vanished, and with her has gone something that this family will never recover, their certainty that they were masters of anything at all. The exodus continued throughout the following week. Those 47 who had fled on the first night were joined by others who had waited to see if escape was possible. The patrols that should have captured them were disorganized, led by overseers still recovering from their incapacitation. The networks that should have tracked them were disrupted by the destruction of records. By the time the militia was finally mobilized, trails had grown cold, and the escaped had scattered across 3 states. Most were never recaptured. Among those who reached freedom was Ruth, the laundress, who would live another 23 years in Philadelphia, where she became a key organizer for the Underground Railroad and helped guide hundreds of others to safety. Solomon, the blacksmith, made it to Canada, where he established a forge that served the free black community of Toronto until his death in 1873. Esther, the woman who had prepared the substances, was captured and executed. But not before she had hidden documentation of the Ashworth system's cruelty in locations that would be discovered decades later by historians seeking evidence of what slavery had actually meant. And Mercy herself? The investigation that followed spent months trying to locate her. Rewards were posted. Slave catchers were hired. Letters were sent to every plantation in the region, every port city, every station that might harbor runaways. She was never found. What is known comes from fragmented reports, second-hand accounts, and the occasional testimony of those who claim to have seen her in the years that followed. A woman matching her description appeared in Virginia in 1849, coordinating an escape that freed 23 people from a tobacco plantation. A similar figure surfaced in Alabama in 1851 after an incident at a cotton operation that bore striking similarities to the Ashworth treatment. Rumors placed her in Kansas during the bleeding violence of the 1850s and in Georgia in 1859, where a fire destroyed a breeding operation and its records. None of these reports could be confirmed. All of them carried the same signature: careful planning, targeted retribution, and an escape rate that suggested intelligence about routes and networks that no single person should have possessed. She had become, in the years after Ashworth, something more than an individual. She had become a method, a possibility, a demonstration that resistance was not only conceivable, but achievable. The Ashworth treatment did not remain contained at Ashworth. Within 6 months of the September events, reports began reaching Charleston of similar incidents at other plantations. Not exact replications, Mercy's network had trained others in principles rather than prescriptions, but adaptations that shared core elements: targeting of specific perpetrators, use of substances that incapacitated without immediately killing, coordinated escapes timed to exploit the resulting chaos. In February 1848, a plantation in Georgia lost 3 overseers to a mysterious illness that struck during a dinner celebrating a successful cotton harvest. The investigating physician could identify no common cause. 14 enslaved people disappeared that night. In May 1848, a South Carolina rice operation experienced a fire that destroyed the main house and all its records during a period when the owner was bedridden with symptoms that matched those reported at Ashworth. The owner survived. His reputation did not. The enslaved community he had terrorized scattered into the swamps and was never fully recovered. In August 1848, a Mississippi cotton plantation lost its entire overseer corps, 5 men, to a coordinated action that left them alive but permanently damaged. The plantation owner, testifying before a legislative committee investigating slave resistance, described his attackers as organized beyond anything we had anticipated, disciplined beyond anything we had feared. By 1850, the phenomenon had acquired a name in official correspondence: the Ashworth Method. Plantation owners wrote to each other about preventive measures. Medical journals published articles about poison detection. Legislative bodies debated laws requiring all food preparation to be supervised by white observers. None of it worked. The method spread because it could not be stopped. It spread through the networks that enslaved people had maintained for generations, the communication systems that masters had believed impossible, the trust relationships that property was not supposed to be capable of forming, the intelligence sharing that connected plantations across hundreds of miles. Each incident inspired others. Each success demonstrated possibility. And each failure, because there were failures, because this was war and not all operations succeeded, provided lessons that were incorporated into future planning. The historical record of this period has been systematically minimized. Southern historians of the late 19th century dismissed reports of coordinated resistance as exaggeration or Northern propaganda. 20th century scholarship was slow to recognize the patterns that connected disparate incidents. It was not until the 1970s, when researchers began examining archives that had been neglected or suppressed, that the full scope of the movement began to emerge. What they found was remarkable: a network that, by 1855, extended from Virginia to Texas, from the Carolina coast to the interior of Mississippi. Hundreds of incidents, thousands of people freed, a system of resistance that operated in the shadows of the slave system and undermined it from within. And at the center of the network, referenced in coded communications and whispered testimonies, was a figure known only as the Gift. Some described her as an old woman, some as young, some as a spirit rather than a person. But all agreed on certain characteristics: scars on her back that told a story of survival, hands that could heal or harm with equal precision, and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. Mercy had become myth. The slave power did not accept its humiliation quietly. By 1852, a coordinated effort to eliminate the Ashworth network had been organized across 6 southern states. Funded by plantation owners who had experienced losses, Staffed by professional slave catchers and militia veterans, the operation represented the most systematic attempt to destroy slave resistance in American history. They called themselves the Committee for Domestic Tranquility. Their methods included infiltration of enslaved communities, torture of captured runaways for intelligence, and the assassination of free black individuals suspected of coordinating escapes. Among their targets was the person they believed responsible for creating the network, the woman who had vanished from Ashworth 7 years earlier. The hunt produced evidence. Not enough to locate Mercy, but enough to understand something of how she operated. Captured members of the network, even under torture, revealed fragments. A woman who appeared and disappeared without warning, who seemed to know things that she could not possibly know, who left behind not destruction, but possibility. Communities stronger after her visit, people more capable of resistance, systems that functioned without her direct involvement. The committee's records, discovered in a Charleston basement in 1947, include a frustrated report from one of their lead investigators. "We are pursuing not a person, but an idea. Every time we believe we have isolated the source, we discover that the network has propagated beyond our ability to contain it. She has taught others, and those others have taught others still. Even if we were to eliminate the original, the system she created would continue to function. We are attempting to destroy something that has become self-perpetuating." In 1855, the committee believed they had finally cornered their target. Intelligence suggested that Mercy was coordinating a major operation in the Alabama Black Belt, a region of intensive cotton production where conditions were particularly brutal and where the potential for mass escape was particularly threatening. The operation was indeed planned. A network of over 200 enslaved people had been organized across 7 plantations. The timing was set for late September, the anniversary date that had become symbolic within the movement. The method was an adaptation of the Ashworth treatment, scaled for a coordinated strike across multiple sites. The committee deployed 40 men to prevent it. They intercepted communications. They arrested suspected participants. They tortured captured network members for details of the operation. And on September 25, 1855, they surrounded a farm where they believed Mercy was hiding. What happened next is recorded in the committee's own documents. "We approached the structure at dawn. Intelligence indicated that the target was inside, along with several associates. Our men entered through all 4 doors simultaneously. The building was empty. On the floor, arranged in a circle, were 7 pieces of broken porcelain, blue and white, with lotus flowers in the Chinese style. In the center of the circle was a single word written in ash: Mercy." The Alabama operation proceeded without interruption. On September 27, 1855, 143 people escaped from 7 plantations. The coordinated incapacitation of key overseers and owners followed the established method. The routes had been prepared. The stations had been alerted. By the time the committee understood what had happened, their quarry had scattered into the night. Mercy was never captured. The committee spent 3 more years searching before acknowledging defeat. Their final report, submitted in 1858, concluded, "The subject remains at large. Her network remains operational. Our efforts have been insufficient to prevent continuing incidents. We recommend a change of strategy. Rather than pursuing the individual, we should focus on the conditions that make her methods effective. Harsher enforcement, more systematic surveillance, greater investment in the control of information among the enslaved population." Their recommendations were implemented. They proved ineffective, and within 6 years, the entire system they sought to preserve would collapse in a war that made the question of catching one escaped slave woman irrelevant. What became of Mercy after 1855 is a matter of speculation rather than documentation. Some accounts place her in Canada, living quietly under an assumed name, dying peacefully in the 1880s in a community of former enslaved people who had built new lives far from their former bondage. Others claim she remained in the South throughout the Civil War, continuing her work as the system crumbled around her, coordinating escapes even as Union armies liberated regions faster than any underground railroad had managed. A third tradition holds that she never lived past 1860, that she was killed in an operation gone wrong, or that she died of natural causes after years of stress and hardship, or that she chose her own end when she felt her work was complete. None of these accounts can be verified, all of them are told. What is verifiable is her legacy. The Baron's account, published in 1852 and widely distributed in abolitionist circles, brought international attention to the Ashworth incident and to the larger phenomenon of organized slave resistance. His description of Mercy, particularly the moment when he called her the bravest soul alive, became one of the most quoted passages in anti-slavery literature. The network she established continued to operate after her disappearance. The techniques she developed were refined and propagated. The principle she embodied, that the enslaved were not merely victims but actors capable of sophisticated resistance, entered the consciousness of a generation that would fight the Civil War. In the decades after emancipation, her story persisted in oral traditions within African American communities. Spirituals contained coded references to Mercy's Way. Folktales described a woman who could heal the sick and punish the wicked with equal skill. Children were told that if they were brave and patient and smart, they could be like the woman who brought the great house low. The pieces of porcelain, her mother's porcelain with the lotus flowers, became artifacts of legend. Some claimed that fragments still existed, hidden in archives and private collections, preserved as relics of resistance. In 1923, a blue and white shard matching the historical descriptions was discovered in a South Carolina field near the former Ashworth property. It now resides in a museum in Atlanta, labeled simply Fragment, believed associated with the Ashworth incident, 1847. The academic study of her life and work accelerated in the late 20th century. Historians recovered documents that had been suppressed. Descendants of the enslaved community at Ashworth shared oral traditions that had been preserved for generations. The Baron's original journal, with marginalia that had never been published, was located in Copenhagen and translated in 1989. A fuller picture emerged, not of a superhuman figure but of an extraordinary ordinary person, a woman who had survived the worst that a brutal system could inflict, who had transformed her pain into purpose, who had refused to accept that the world as it was had to be the world as it remained. Whether she died in freedom or in bondage, in peace or in violence, with companionship or alone, cannot be determined. What can be determined is that she accomplished what she set out to accomplish. She made them understand. She demonstrated that resistance was possible. She proved that the system was not as strong as it pretended to be. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about stories that shaped a nation forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Mercy's story touched your heart. Share it so that her memory will never be forgotten. And remember, the next time you hear someone claim that the enslaved accepted their condition, that they didn't fight back, that they couldn't organize, remember Mercy. Remember the scars she carried. Remember the knowledge she accumulated. Remember the night when she walked into a master's bedroom and told him exactly what he needed to hear. She was, in the Baron's words, the bravest soul alive. And she changed everything.